Hi, everybody. Like I said, I'm going to present. Sorry, I'm just getting this whole situated here. Okay. So I was going to share with you the American Revolution, so that way we can kind of do this since we had a snow day last week, all those good things. So here we go. So the American Revolution, this is chapter 8. It is going to cover some of the causes that we didn't cover in the timeline, and then it goes into the war itself. So like I said, AP College Board, they don't really focus too much on the battles. They want to know what happened before and after. So you cover what happened before, most of it with the timeline. We're going to cover what happened after when we get back from our nice break. And so let's just talk about a little bit of what goes on right before the revolution starts. All right, so some of the most famous thing that happens is the Battle of Lexington and Concord. It's considered to be kind of the beginning of the war itself. April 19th, 1775. There were some colonists outside of Boston in the town of Concord who were hiding weapons, and they were basically trying to gather as many weapons as possible if there was possibly a breakout of conflict between the British and the colonists. So British got a little tip from somebody that the colonists were hiding weapons. At this point, remember, the British actually had about 5,000 troops stationed in Boston because of a lot of the activities that was going on, anti-British activities. So somebody gave them a little bit of a tip, and then somebody gave the colonists a tip that the British were going to try to find these weapons. So Paul Revere, William Dawes, who were the two men that are going to go warn the colonists of the British encounter, and the militia, or sometimes they were known as Minutemen, they were called up and they encounter the British at Lexington in the early morning of April 1775. Lexington was basically in between, like halfway between Boston and Concord. So the colonists at Lexington slowed down the British march. The Americans were forced to retreat under heavy British fire. 8 Americans were killed in the brief encounter, and the British then continue on their way to Concord. Luckily for the colonists in Concord, the colonists in Lexington slowed down the British advance, and the colonists were able to continue moving all the weapons that they were hiding in Concord to another location further west, to the town of Worcester. So afterwards, the British have to march back to Boston, and they suffered 250,000 casualties. Sorry, 250 casualties. Well, 250,000 casualties. There weren't even that many soldiers there. The 250 casualties because the colonists had lined up. There were hundreds of them. The militia had lined up behind stone walls and trees, and they were just picking off the British as they were marching back to Boston. So really only 8 deaths for the colonists, but over 250 casualties for the British. They go back to Boston. It was a morale boost for the colonists. Now, technically, the Battle of Lexington was a British victory because the colonists are going to be forced to retreat. But it is going to be a morale boost for the colonists and makes them pretty happy. So this is a map showing where Boston is located. So Boston's over here on the right, and the British are going to cross over the Charles River, and they start marching to Concord. So Concord's all the way over here. Okay, they're stopped in Lexington. The blue line here represents Revere's route. The green line represents Dawes' route. Over here, it says British patrol stops Revere, Dawes, and Prescott. So Samuel Prescott is another person who joins up with Dawes and Revere. And Revere is captured by the British. He's eventually released. Dawes flees back to Lexington, and Prescott escapes and continues on to Concord. And then he continues on beyond that to warn the colonists of what was happening. So that was on the way there. And then on the way back, all these yellow battle symbols represent attacks by the colonists. So as the British are making their way back, they're going through all these little towns, and there are hundreds of militia that have joined up, and they're just attacking them on their way back to Charlestown, which was where the colonists are eventually going to set themselves up. Okay, so Charlestown, the British make their way back over to Boston Neck, but the colonists, the militia, they're going to start to situate themselves right here on the Charlestown Peninsula. All right, so after the fighting at Lexington and Concord, that led the colonists, who had promised at the first Continental Congress, they said, if nothing happens between now and May of 1775, fine. If something does, then we're going to have another meeting. So they have another meeting that starts in May of 1775. So it starts May 10th, 1775. couple of things they do. They draft new appeals to British restraints and taxes. So they are going to, they're going to be divided. A lot of New Englanders thought the colonies should declare independence. Other groups felt that they should kind of negotiate a little bit more with the British, but they do agree to a couple of things. Let's draft another document that sends to the British to let them know how we feel about the whole situation. But let's also start preparing for war. So it was the people in New England and other colonies that wanted to declare independence. They started calling for money set aside to pay for an army and navy and equip them. And then also they wanted to create this Continental Army. So we're going to see Continental becomes a word that's used a lot. Like we see the Continental Congress, the Continental Army. They're going to start to raise money that they call Continentals. So we're going to see this be kind of a name that they're going to use pretty often. So they create an army and a navy, and they also write another document that tells everybody why they decided to do that. Okay, so Congress adopted the Declaration of the Causes and the Necessities of Taking Up Arms and called on the colonies to start providing troops. So we're going to see that they basically just kind of list the reasons why they decided to go to war, and they're going to choose George Washington as commander-in-chief of the new Continental Army. And he was sent to Boston to lead the Massachusetts militia and also volunteer units that were sent to Boston from other colonies. So a lot of the New England colonies start sending soldiers, and they start calling themselves the Continental Army or the Continentals. We're going to see that term used as well. So the effects of this whole thing, colonies begin preparations for war, right? So Congress is also going to authorize another force under Benedict Arnold to start raiding Canada and hopefully, well, basically Quebec. We talked about the Quebec Act. So basically the colonists in Quebec were on the side of the British. So they're going to start to, we're going to see some raids into Quebec territory. All right, so Benedict Arnold, there he is there, famous traitor or turncoat, as sometimes they're known. Patriot and loyalist ideas are going to clash for 14 months. So basically you have like some people who are supportive of independence, other people who are like, no, Britain's still our country. We have to stay on their side. That takes place from April 1775 to July 1776. So May 1775, under Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold. So Ethan Allen was in charge of a bunch of militia known as the Green Mountain Boys. They were from the area of Vermont, which at that point was still not Vermont. It was disputed between New York and New Hampshire. But those colonists were known as, they were in an area that was known as Vermont, but it wasn't officially its own colony. Anyway, but those guys, Ethan Allen and some of his militia, and then Benedict Arnold also had his own force of militia and continental soldiers. So they're going to capture two British garrisons or British forts. One is called Fort Ticonderoga, that's in upstate New York, and the other one's called Crown Point, that's also in New York. So Crown Point is on Lake George, and then Ticonderoga is on Lake Champlain. So both of these forts they had British soldiers there. Ticonderoga had 48 soldiers and one commanding officer. Crown Point had 8 soldiers and one commanding officer. So you can see they were not very heavily manned, but they had lots of gunpowder, lots of weapons, like in particular cannon, which the colonists needed really, really, really badly. They didn't have any of those kinds of weapons, so they knew that these forts had them. They take over the forts, so 2 important strategic places for the colonists. This is Crown Point. Now, it was destroyed mostly in a fire in 1773. So when those soldiers were there, when the colonists and the Continentals were going to take over, they were just there mostly, for peace of mind for the British. Like, well, somebody's there. I mean, it's eight of them and a commanding officer, but whatever. However, Crown Point had a lot of weapons and ammunition, which they're going to take and bring back to Boston to help with the Continental Army that was stationed there, surrounding the British in Boston. And this is Fort Ticonderoga, which actually is a really good example of a British star-shaped fort. So it does have like the different points. It was at first a French fort called Fort Carillon, and then after the French and Indian War, it was taken over by the British. So it was built in 1759 by the French, and then when the war went on, it was taken over in 1763 by the British. Here's what it looked like. So part of it was built by the French, and then part was built up even more by the British. So you can find the history teacher here in this picture. I went to Fort Ticonderoga a couple of years ago with my husband on the way up to Lake Placid to a hockey tournament when he was coaching hockey. And we did a little detour. He was like, how long is it? I'm like, like 15, 20-minute detour. It was like an hour. So he was not very happy. We were set, our time was a little bit set back there, but here I am at the fort. It was about to close when we got there, but the guy that was working was really nice and he let us walk around. So find the history teacher. So this part here was built by the French on the right, and then this part over here on the left was built by the English. So you can see a little bit different stone was used, and you could tell by looking at them what the difference was a little bit. And here's another view of that's find the history teacher. So here's the British part, and then here's the French part. So you can see the difference a little bit there. Beautiful fort. It was one of those days that was just gorgeous. So here's the type of cannon that the colonists took from Crown Point and Ticonderoga. And this is looking over at Lake Champlain. Look at that beautiful foliage. It was, I think, like the first week in November that we went. But this is a type of cannon that was pretty typical. This was a 3-pounder. So this was what they wanted to get. And they took that and brought it back to Boston. And then here's another view of Lake Champlain from the fort. It was one of those absolutely beautiful fall days. Oh my goodness, look at those mountains. Those are the Berkshire Mountains. Oh, they are gorgeous. They're part of the Appalachian Mountains. Okay. So they bring these guns back to Boston, and the colonists set themselves up on a couple of hills overlooking Boston. And they have their cannon and they're just digging trenches. And the British are like, what are they doing up there? This is not going to last. So on June 17, 1775, the first true battle of the American Revolutionary War takes place, where British troops attack colonial militia who are actually on these hills surrounding Boston. They're occupying these hills. Okay? I said it just like Boston people, right? Of course, if you're from New Jersey, somebody say Boston. All right, so this actually was called Bunker Hill, but most of the fighting took place on Breed's Hill, which was next to Bunker Hill. It was named after a farmer who owned the land. His name was Breed, but he allowed the colonists to use that to situate some cannons facing Boston Harbor, facing the fleet that was in Boston Harbor. And the British are going to send about 2,000 soldiers across Boston Harbor. They land them on the bottom of Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill, and then the British tried to make their way up the hill with the colonists on top. It took 3 tries for the British to actually take the hills. So after 3 attempts, they finally do, mostly because the colonists ran out of ammunition. But the British that attack are going to suffer over 1,000 casualties. So the Americans kind of claim a victory because they were able to inflict heavy casualties and the hills were not taken over without a fight, right? So the British are going to win this battle technically, but the colonists once again claim it as a moral victory. All right, so here's a pretty famous painting by Andrew Wyeth, I think it was. So here is the British marching in their lines. Okay, so they're making their way up Breed's Hill. You can see that some soldiers have already fallen all up here. So the colonists would have been all the way up here at the top of the painting, just to kind of give you an idea. So the British, though, they're still marching in their lines. They're keeping time with the drums. So it was pretty easy for the colonists to fire their shots and take down many of the soldiers. All right, so here's Boston where the British were stationed. Here's Charlestown, which is today a suburb of Boston. My best friend growing up lives there, so I'll get to that in a second. Here's Breed's Hill, where most of the fighting took place. And then you can see Bunker Hill is actually back here. There was some fighting on Bunker Hill, but Breed's Hill was where most of the colonists had set themselves up. So you can see here this like little squiggly line, and then right here also, that's where the trenches were built. So the British have to land here at Morton's Point and try to march their way up the hill. Americans retreat, and they go back to Cambridge, which is by present-day Harvard University. And that's where they were camped. All right, so here's an engraving from the time period. So here's Boston. The British try to fire on the colonists, but they're too far away. That's why they have to land troops. And then here you can see all this white here is supposed to be the smoke of the British making their way up. And here's all the Continental Army, all right here. So that was basically one artist's version of it. All right, so this is a photo I took from the front seat of my car. This was in like 2000, oh my gosh, like 12 maybe when I was up there last. Or when I was up there at this point, and you can see my dirty windshield. This is the Bunker Hill Monument. So this is where the fighting took place, like where I'm driving up was where like the British were marching up, basically. Now there's all homes and everything, but there is in the middle like a little memorial, and here is the Bunker Hill Monument. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. One of the commanding officers for the Americans said, make sure that you can actually get a good shot and not miss your shot because they didn't have much ammunition. So that was a famous quote from the battle. And this is Colonel William Prescott, who was the commander of the colonists. He was the one that said, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." So he was one of the militia leaders. All right. So after the battle, the colonists at the Second Continental Congress, they were still meeting at this point in time. The colonists wanted to seek peace, but at the same time, they were creating an army, they were setting aside money for it, and then they fought that Battle of Bunker Hill, right? So there were a lot of people that didn't want independence, right? But they did want to change in their relationship with Britain. So in 1775, the delegates are going to vote to send an olive branch petition to King George, in which they pledge their loyalty and ask the king to intercede with Parliament to try and secure peace and protection of colonial rights. They're actually asking the king to intercede. They were letting him know that they were his loyal subjects and they wanted to continue being loyal subjects. They didn't want all this fighting to take place. However, it was according to the king, too little, too late, right? By the time the king actually gets the olive branch petition, he had already heard about the battles of Lexington and Concord and the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he had declared the colonies in rebellion. So the king doesn't actually ever read the olive branch petition, and so he is going to dismiss the Second Continental Congress's plea, and he is going to basically declare that the colonies are in rebellion. So he asked Parliament pass. He basically agrees to the Prohibitory Act, which Parliament had passed in August of 1775, which declared the colonies in rebellion. And then a few months later, Parliament's going to forbade all trade and shipping between Britain and the colonies. So the colonists are going to start to move towards independence. The olive branch petition fails. So we go past all this because whatever. All right. So Common Sense is going to be a pamphlet written by Thomas Paine. He writes this in January of 1776, and a lot of people start to read it. So it's going to, oh my gosh. So it is going to be read by hundreds of thousands of colonists. And basically, in the pamphlet, he urges independence. He urges a republican form of government. He says that the king is tyrannical, the king is taking too much power, Parliament doesn't listen to the colonists. The colonists have been functioning as their own independent country for quite a while. It's about time the colonists use their common sense and start to act as their own country and to declare independence. So as a result, more colonists call for independence. Thomas Jefferson actually uses a bunch of the ideas that Thomas Paine writes in his Common Sense when he is actually writing his Declaration of Independence, which we'll get to right now. All right, I'm just going to go past all this. All right, so Paine actually donates all the money he makes off of Common Sense to the Continental Army. And he says, "As my wish was to serve an oppressed people and assist in a just and good cause, I conceived that the honor of it would be promoted by my declining to make even the usual profits of an author." So he didn't make any profits off of Common Sense, although it was very popular and sold about 150,000 copies in just a couple of months. All right, so declaring independence. Richard Henry Lee, there he is on the right. He was a delegate from Virginia, and he comes back to the Continental Congress after they had their recess in June of 1776, and he brings with him a declaration that he wrote and that the Virginia House of Burgesses approved. It said, "Resolved, that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved." People read that. Some of them are outraged by it. We don't want that. Other people are like, yes, this is perfect. This is exactly what we want. So either way, after a couple days of debate on independence or not, June 11, 1776, Congress agrees to appoint a committee of 5. They have been debating, and they finally said, let's just write up a document, and then we'll have our Congress adjourn. All the representatives can go back to their home colonies and consult with the colonial government to determine what are we going to do next. So on June 11, 1776, Congress appointed a committee of 5, which consisted of John Adams, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. And their job was to draft a declaration explaining the reasons for independence. So they figured, well, if we get to that point where we are going to declare independence, we should probably have a document explaining why. Thomas Jefferson was chosen to write the final document, and the committee presented it to Congress on June 28, 1776. So the 5 men stayed behind. They stayed in Philadelphia. They got together, they wrote down some ideas, but then Thomas Jefferson, because he was considered to be such a great writer, he didn't like to speak in public, but he had a really good way with words on paper. He also was really into the Enlightenment. He read a lot of things like by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Baron de Montesquieu, John Locke, all these guys you learn about the Enlightenment in world history. And he decided that he was going to use some of their ideas and wrote this final document that we know today as the Declaration of Independence. So here's the Declaration Committee. You have Thomas Jefferson, Roger Sherman, Ben Franklin, Robert Livingston, and John Adams. And they were all involved in the writing of the final document. On July 2nd, 1776, Congress voted to accept Richard Henry Lee's resolution declaring their independence from Great Britain. So technically on July 2nd, the Second Continental Congress voted to declare independence. It's on July 4th that the document, the Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson wrote with the Committee of 5, was actually adopted. So then what they have to do is bring this document back to the colonial governments, and the colonial governments have to accept the Declaration of Independence, and most of them do pretty quickly. And so the Revolutionary War begins. All right, so the Declaration of Independence itself is going to be adopted on July 4th. That's why we celebrate July 4th on July 4th, right? We celebrate Independence Day. That's when we accepted the document. So this is the first half of the Declaration, of the American Revolution. I will post the second half once I complete it, but I didn't want to make you guys do all of it at once. And I'll see you later. Have a good day.